Today, we're here to talk about what it's like to be a woman in a man's world. Yeah, right? And I had some people ask me, Sophie, why is it still a man's world? Why is it not this world? Or why is it not a woman's world? Because the women's movement is what's hot right now. And I said, well, you know, this is how this whole event came to be. About 18 months ago, I got really sick, and so I couldn't work. I couldn't walk very well. I had abdomen pain. I canceled surgery 3 times. And in my recovery, I started to do a lot of reflection. And I started to look at what was making me sick, and I started to look at the type of work that I was doing. And then when I was going to look for people to help me with my illness, they said to me, Sophie, you're out of balance. You're out of balance. And I was like, well, what does this out of balance mean? And so at some level, I was out of balance muscularly, and some level, I was out of balance with my skeletal posture, and at some level, I was out of balance with my energy. And so I started to do some research, and I started to think, what's next for me? Because I think the work that I've been doing isn't serving me anymore. Me helping large organizations make more money and put more ROI is not necessarily making me more fulfilled, and I think it's maybe not serving me in terms of my health. So I started to do some research. And I started to also notice there was this big conversation for women. And I started to notice that there was also this conversation about gender inequality. And I'll be very honest with you, I didn't realize there was a gender inequality issue, which might come as a shock because I'm a woman. And I'm a little bit embarrassed and ashamed to say that I didn't know 100 years ago women didn't have the right to vote. And I didn't know that in some countries, and maybe even Canada, I'm not even that sure, to be honest with you, that women couldn't say no to their husbands if they wanted to have sex about just over 50 years ago. And I started to think, that's ridiculous. And I also started to think, it's ridiculous that I'm a woman and I don't understand or notice that this issue is going on. So I started to do some research. And I started to notice in my research some pretty alarming statistics. Less than 5% of female-led ventures are receiving venture capital funding. Less than 30% of women are leaders, whether that be in the entrepreneurial world or the small business or senior leader or global. Here in Canada, only about 26% of our parliament are female MPs. Less than 5% of women are being mentored. And I thought, geez, why is it, even in the mentorship realm, I didn't understand that. And here's what happens. When you start looking at the top, it's more and more men and less women. And if men are doing the mentoring, and most mentoring is happening after hours at a bar over a glass of wine or a beer, they don't want to be seen with some young woman because of the sexual innuendos that can imply. So women are not being mentored. And that's when I thought, you know, this is an issue that I would like to start to put some energy behind. I started to notice I had some desire. All of a sudden, desire was coming back for me. And so I started going to conferences and I started going to events and I started learning about this gender inequality. And at these conferences and events, I started to notice there was not a lot of men in the room. And I started to think, how are we going to move this conversation forward without the men? And I started to wonder, how are we as women inviting the men into the conversation? Are we doing it in a way that's welcoming and safe for them to join us? And so I thought, in these events I'm going to, I'm hearing a lot of cool TED Talks, and here's the 3 gold nuggets that you want to take away. But what I wasn't hearing was the experience. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could just hear what it was like for somebody in her 60s, what life was like 40 years ago in this world? Because I think it was a lot different than what I'm experiencing today. And I thought, what about a woman in her 50s? Wouldn't it be cool to hear a woman in her 50s? And what about in her 40s? And what about in her 30s? And what about the women in their 20s? What should they be really happy about that the trailblazers paved the way for? And just hear it as an experience. And so I have questions, because I'm naturally a curious person. For those of you who don't know, my parents divorced when I was young, and so I didn't have grandparents around. So I actually didn't hear the stories that maybe many of you women heard. And so perhaps that's why I was a little ignorant when it came to this gender inequality issue. And although I'm embarrassed and ashamed of my lack of knowledge, I'm proud to be here today and to have all of you join me in the conversation and just ask these ladies for their insight and their experience and their perspective. So I want to remind you that everything that gets said here today is just that. It's an insight or an experience or a perspective from our point of view. It's not the truth. It's not what's right. It's not wrong. I just want you to know it's an insight and an experience. And so you may notice you're getting triggered And if you get triggered, that's okay. I'm just going to ask you to let it go and to talk to your consciousness and just to listen for our experience. Because what I know about human beings is when we hear someone else's experience of what life is like, it creates this energetic emotion that starts to create empathy. And we are emotional beings. And when we can get to a place of empathy and we can get to a place of awareness, then we can start to create change. And so in this moment right here, I just want to ask you to think to yourself, what do you want to be known for in life? And just like let the answers come to you as I ask you these questions. What do you want people to say about you when you're not in the room? How do you want people to feel in your presence? What's the legacy you want to be known for? So tonight is a real opportunity for both the women and the men in the room to understand that there is still a gender gap. There is still a gap between where men are and the access that they have and where women are and the access that we have. And it's not to say that we're not rising and we're not rising fast. It's just to say that there's a gap. And what you hear tonight might spark something inside of you that you can do something or say something or change something that can actually help you be known for the person that you want to be known for. So I just want to create that as the context for how to listen for this evening. So I've asked the ladies to share a couple of minutes of who they are so you could get some insight, and then I'm going to start to ask some questions, and we're just going to have a conversation. And I'm inviting you to participate. I would love to hear your questions. And so it's a big room. What I'm going to ask you to do is just put your hand up and just, yell your question out, and if it's to a specific person, put your hand up and say who it's for, And I'll facilitate back and forth, and I'm going to try to keep it as open and interactive as possible. And then we're going to close up the evening. This is part of the evening is to take about an hour. And then I'm going to ask that you guys continue the conversation over some more drinks and some food. And then the whole evening will end around 10 o'clock unless you guys choose to stay a little later.